Hi, good morning. My name is Belen Leal. I'm a first-year honors student at Lone Star Kingwood here. And for my project this semester, I titled it, "The Children Are for Sale." My project is based on strengthening legal frameworks to combat underage sex trafficking in Houston. We are the #1 city for human trafficking in all cities in the United States. Now, when I first saw this statistic, I was surprised. But clearly, if we are #1 in this social issue, we have to be doing something wrong. So this led me to my research question. What are the key effective legal frameworks regarding underage sex trafficking, and how can they be enhanced to better combat this issue in the Houston area more effectively? Well, in order to try and answer this question, I had to look at legislations and codes. I used one of the main legislations titled Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. This was one of the first drafted acts regarding human trafficking in Texas, and we were one of the first states to enact these laws, along with Washington. And to relate it to a more recent act, I used the most recent reauthorization of 2022 in order to see how these ideas or laws evolved and what amendments and implications changed. And to relate this project back to Texas, I used penal codes regarding prostitution and trafficking of persons. Now, I want you to take a look at this graph. What you're looking at is where these 10 offenders were all convicted of trafficking crimes regarding minors. So out of these 10, I want to ask you if you think the red is if they were required to register as a sex offender or weren't required to register. Well, you'd be surprised to find out that 7 of these 10 offenders were not required to register, where only 3 registered. So we can see that there is a problem happening. So what do these young victims of sex trafficking look like? How can we profile them? Well, they most likely have a high dependence on adults. They are constantly being threatened and being told what to do by these adults. Homelessness. Oftentimes, victims come from these cases where they run away from home, they get recruited into a prostitution situation, and this later becomes into a trafficking situation. There's also a justice system involvement or welfare system involvement. Many times, victims also come from areas from foster homes or situations like that. Signs of child abuse, that be bruises, cuts, or anything of the sort, can be a huge indication of a victim. Unexplained absences from school, and this can be due to traffickers making the children work during these times where they're supposed to be at school. Withdrawn behavior, due to the many traumatic experiences that these children have experienced. They are not going to be like any other children. Sudden increase of expensive possessions. And this can relate more to a younger adult age gap, that'd be 15 to 17 or around there, where when they were once not able to afford expensive clothes or expensive shoes, they are now being seen with these expensive items. That could be due to fast money or things like that. So let's talk a little bit more of what the Act of 2000 did for human trafficking. Well, it established the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps being prevention, protection, and prosecution. In order to prevent this problem, they stated that they would need annual reports, and for protection, they established a T visa. What you're looking at is what a visa looks like, and they would list it what type of visa it was in the corner, but this T visa is only for victims of human trafficking. And in order to receive this visa, they would have to cooperate with authorities. That'd be answering questions about their case or things like that. And for prosecution, since I mentioned that this was one of the first acts signed regarding human trafficking, they set the base for strengthened penalties for prosecutors to use to convict traffickers. So for the reauthorization of 2022, it did change a little bit. We saw that it touched on the underage victims, whereas the 2001 didn't. It stated that victims are victims regardless of proof, child victims, and it prioritized data and research. It made many new programs to make reports, that one of the main ones being the Texas Human Trafficking Task Force, and it enhanced support services. It made many new grants and new programs to better support these victims. So what does prosecution in Texas for these crimes look like? And this is all information regarding minors. Well, for human trafficking, it does not require the proof of force, fraud, or coercion to be involved. It's very different when it comes to adults because a victim must prove how they were a victim, that they were a victim. It is also a first-degree felony, and there's no probation. Well, for solicitors of prostitution or buyers of sex, it is a second-degree felony now, where it was once a misdemeanor, so we can see some changes being made there. It is 2 to 20 years jail time for these solicitors. The common denominator between these two is that you can apply for bail for both of these crimes, but it has to be before your trial. But bail is oftentimes very expensive, so some people can't afford it, but there is still the possibility of it being accepted. And on a side note, I'd also like to mention that these underage victims that are immigrants and go to court for their status, they are not provided a lawyer. The American Bar Association does state that they encourage their lawyers to go out and find these crimes and help these children, but it would be pro bono, meaning that they will be working for free. So now, I want you to take a look at all of these headlines regarding human trafficking and prostitution that are from this year alone. Those are a lot of cases. It was very easy to search these. All I had to put in was human trafficking prostitution cases of 2024. So what can we do to combat this issue? Well, we can look to other countries for inspiration or a blueprint to follow. When we look at New Zealand and Sweden, we see that they have taken two very opposite approaches to this situation to combat human trafficking. Well, when we look at New Zealand, they have legalized prostitution. How, you may be asking? It is regulated. It's limited to certain areas or brothels, and these businesses must follow regulations stated by the government. Employees are also able to sue their employers for any reason, that be mistreatment, harassment, or anything like that, and they won't face any legal consequences themselves. There is a con to this, though. New Zealand isn't able to give accurate numbers for their trafficking victims and see if it's actually helped, because these cases might fall into the wrong categories due to prostitution being legalized in that country. Well, when we look at Sweden, on the other hand, they have made prostitution illegal. They have taken a victim-centered approach. Instead of asking the victim to prove that they were a victim, they asked the trafficker or the pimp to prove how their victim wasn't a victim. I think this is a very key takeaway that Texas should look into and consider implementing into our laws. Sweden has made the prostitution so socially unacceptable that now 70% of men agree that a buyer of sex should be convicted, whereas before only 20% agreed with this statement. So we can see that their efforts have been working so far, and they have been successful in combating human trafficking. So what is being done currently in Texas to combat these issues? Well, we have the Texas Human Trafficking Prevention Task Force, like I mentioned before. They do annual in-person reports, and these reports are made in order to try and come up with ways to combat human trafficking. There's also many public awareness campaigns. Many new nonprofit organizations have been funded and developed to try and raise awareness for this issue and raise money to help the cause. Streets closing down with heavy prostitution activity is also common now in the Houston area, and this is actually a picture that you can see from the Bisonette area, which is one of our busiest streets for prostitution. They close down these streets and they give people curfews in order to follow to try and reduce the traffic and buying of sex, and it has proven to be somewhat effective. We also have the Mayor's Office of Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence Strategic Plan. Now, this plan was stated in 2015, and it has only been 56% of the way completed as of now. So we can see that any efforts to try and combat this issue or any new ideas to improve it are going to take a while to come into place. And now, like I mentioned before, prostitution is a felony. So we can see that Texas is making a connection between these two issues and trying to address it. So what would future research look like? Well, we can look into how funding could be provided for more lawyers. We can look into how other countries and cities combat human trafficking, like New Zealand and Sweden, and maybe include that into our legislations and codes. And we can also look into other forms of human trafficking, like labor trafficking. And I'd like to leave you with this last note. The children should not be for sale. And these are my works cited. Thank you.